In the last video, we talked about human migrations over a huge amount of human history into the invention of agriculture, which led to the rise of large cities. Now, these large cities might have had maybe a few hundred to a couple of thousand people living in them, but what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about what happens that advances those cities into not only this city, but the surrounding areas, and establishes a culture and a civilization. McDougall and Little, in their book World History Patterns and Interaction, a very popular world history textbook, the one that my school uses as well, they discussed 5 special characteristics of civilization. And when you think about these civilizations' characteristics, it makes sense that these would be some of the big ones. We're looking at specialized workers, complex institutions, advanced cities, new advanced technology, and the ability to keep record. Now, there's going to be some serious overlap within those different areas as well. For example, record keeping is done by specialists that learn how to write. When I talk about civilizations of any kind, whether it's Sumer, whether it's the Indus Valley, whether it's the Roman or Greeks, I like to think of it in terms of SPRITE. I learned the teaching technique behind SPRITE from a master teacher from Blythewood High School in South Carolina whenever I was in college. When we look at SPRITE, we break down the social, political, religious, intellectual, technological, and economic sides of a civilization. We're going to learn that when we apply SPRITE to the different 4 original culture civilizations of the world, looking at Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the Nile River Valley, and the Huanghe Valley in China, we're going to learn that these things really do manifest themselves in very similar and yet very different ways. The first thing that I want to do is I want to look at Mesopotamia. Now, the word means land between the rivers. And which rivers are we talking about? We're looking at the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is modern day Iraq. Now, what would happen is these 2 rivers that kind of winded through the land would create natural irrigation through these floods that would happen, and then they will leave a layer of dark, nasty silt mud all over the ground that was actually really good as a fertilizer for agriculture. Now, over time, the unpredictability of these rivers led to massive flooding that would wipe out whole cities and destroy huge amounts of work and laborers in the field. This really does kind of stink when you really think about it. So what they eventually did in the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley is they learned how to build irrigation ditches, which helped them to better control the water, and they brought the water into their fields so that they could produce enough food that they could support a large growing population, which really freed up a ton of people where they didn't have to figure out what they were going to eat the next day. Now they can go off and learn how to do things like make wheels or pottery, or maybe even learn to write. And so when you think about society and you think about how specialization happened, and you think about how technology even happened, to kind of look at that one a little bit, it wasn't possible if it weren't for agriculture, which allowed surpluses of food to exist in places like Mesopotamia and freed people up to use their skills in other ways. When you look at the political elements of the Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia, you see how they arranged their land around their cities as individual countries, if you will. These are called city-states. In other words, a city that acts like a state and has its own political boundary and its own ability to govern within. Each one of these different city-states would have been led by a set of priests who had power given to them through gods. Now, really what it is these guys would have been a social elite, and they would have been given power based on the fact that they could maybe write, they were literate, they used writing in order to keep and retain power, but since they had the ability to communicate with the gods, most of the time people would have given them a high level of political power. So priests actually somewhat were governors of Sumerian city-states. Now, one thing that I do also want to talk with you guys about when it comes to power and politics in this region is that just like a good old game of King of the Mountain, everyone is always trying to get on top and lead. And so whenever you would see one technological innovation or one group gain enough power due to their advances over other groups, maybe with the invention of iron, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, you always see another group try to adapt that to meet their needs and then take over power in the region. And so you're going to see the invention of the world's first empire by Emperor Sargon of the Akkadians. Now, this guy was able to basically conquer all the city-states and establish his own empire over this area, which meant that all these different city-states in the region came under his ultimate sovereignty. The thing is, though, about Sargon of Akkad is that he didn't last very long before the Babylonians climbed up the mountain. And then after that, they were knocked off the mountain by the Hittites and then the Persians and so on and so forth. When we talk about the intellectual side of things, though, it gets kind of important to look at what in particular the Babylonians did, and that is they established the Code of Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi's code was the first legal system that established a set of laws that applied to everyone in the land. This system of laws actually applied to many different facets of life, from marriage to theft to murder. It also applied to all social classes, but social stratification still helped the elites, as it does today, really, from suffering the same degree of punishment as someone that might have been of the peasant masses. We can't discuss the intellectual accomplishments of Mesopotamia without talking about the world's first writing system, that is cuneiform. Now, there's an awesome video about the origin of writing by Extra Credits, which actually has their own extra history version. I just watched it, and they talk a little bit about record keeping and the history thereof. And cuneiform was so important because at first it started to represent symbols that might have been used to tally up lists. So they might have kept lists of types of food that they might have had in storage in their ziggurats. They might have kept lists of certain animals or things that they might have had. And eventually the language developed in such a way that they use these little wedge type styluses that they would use strokes, basically make strokes in clay tablets to keep track of things. And this is how the writing system emerged, and it started to represent sounds and eventually led to such sophisticated writing as to be able to record the entire Epic of Gilgamesh. If you haven't seen the Epic of Gilgamesh, I'm also going to include a link in this description to an awesome video adaptation, just a quick 10-minute thing about the Epic of Gilgamesh. I think you'll really like the story, and you'll see a lot of similarities between this epic and other epics like Beowulf and the Iliad and the Odyssey. What the heck? I missed the R for religion. Let's talk about it. Religiously, these guys were all polytheistic. And talking about Mesopotamia, they all worshipped a slew of different gods and believed in the afterlife. And oh yeah, if you've watched the Epic of Gilgamesh video, you're going to see that the afterlife really did kind of suck for everyone. It was, people would eat dust, and it was nothing but death and despair and gnashing of teeth, and there was no heaven in their system. They also believed that a different patron god would probably protect each and every city, and they worshiped different sets of gods depending on which city-state that you lived in. They had their own chief god that was designed to protect or whatever it might be, and also if you ticked off the gods, they would send warfare and death and destruction through the form of natural disasters like earthquakes. The largest buildings in each of these city-states would have been ziggurats, or large temples that were used for religious purposes, for political purposes, and also for the storage of extra grain, so that in bad times they had a little bit of food to give out to the masses and keep the civilization going, which is pretty important. In terms of technology, they would have had to have had a great understanding of geometry in order to build some of these ziggurats. You can see the symmetry, you can see the that there would be a lot of intricate design. There'd also probably be a lot of different types of manpower and maybe even different types of tools that would be used to shape stones and to build these structures they were able to build. In addition to that, you saw the invention of things like the wheel, invention of things like bronze that would make superior weapons that we talked about in the previous video, and eventually you would see how iron is going to really be the first weapon of mass destruction, because your Hittite group was able to come in and utterly decimate and take over groups because of the invention of iron. And like always, through cultural diffusion, these different forms of technology would go out to people in the neighboring cities or neighboring areas, who would then try to run up the mountain with their new technology and either match or ascend beyond the greatness of the empire before them using the same exact technology. I've already referenced irrigation ditches in the beginning of this video, but it's also very important to understand that these things are what made agriculture possible because of the inconsistency of the flooding in the Tigris and Euphrates River areas. In terms of architecture, these guys would use things like arches and columns and geometry to make their ziggurats. They used ramps to get things up places. So these guys were very, very architecturally savvy. Also, maybe I should have said this when we were talking about intellectual, but they also developed a calendar based on units of 60. Finally, when we look at economics, these guys were trading with people in order to survive. They didn't have a bunch of natural resources in the middle of the Fertile Crescent area, no real access to things like brick, natural barriers, any of this stuff. So there was a lot of encouragement encouraged trade beyond even Mesopotamia. And so you can see where eventually these guys were doing trade as far as the Egyptians and maybe even with people of the Indus Valley civilization. Bartering was very much alive and well during the age of Mesopotamian empires. In this video, we discussed Mesopotamia. We discussed SPRITE in terms of Mesopotamia and addressed some of the basic characteristics of what a civilization is. In the next video, we're going to do the same thing, except we're going to look at Egypt and eventually the Indus Valley and then eventually the Yellow River Valley as well. So stay tuned. Like, subscribe, share if you like what I'm talking about in these videos, and hope you guys are ready to beast it in your world history class. Thank you very much.